I talked to Jerry about it.
Excuse me?
Then I talked to Jerry about it. And he had a postcard picture, a postcard from back then.
And we found a 1910 postcard of it. So, but that's all in any literature. Nothing written about it.
Well, so were these kids by themselves, or did they have? Yeah, I just wonder how they. Somebody that knows something about this. If there were kids in there, we just have to.
Yeah, if there's kids, they know about everything, but they don't necessarily tell adults.
Well, that's true.
Kathleen, did you have something you wanted to say before we got started?
Oh yeah, I was just telling Stacy that the meeting is about to get started.
Oh, okay.
Nice dinosaur background and back you, Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll play into the program tonight, or it's part of the theme tonight. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll get started here. Good evening again, and I can greet happy summer to you since we started summer on Sunday night. I'll say hello to the co-host of the room there, Brittany.
Wasn't last night the longest night? Wasn't yesterday the longest day of the year?
That was on Sunday, yeah.
Hi, Jerry. Hi, everyone.
Everybody say hi to Brittany. And hey, Brittany, I got a question as I always do for you. I like to put you on the spot, right?
I know. I never know the answer though.
So, well, you know the answer to this one because it's about you. But when you were in school, did you ever like call school and say, "I can't make it in today because I'm feeling bad"? Without your parents knowing about it?
Of course I did, and then I'd go bowling.
Oh, you know, is that right? Well, there's a story about this kid named Michael that called into the school and said, Michael will not be in school today because he has a cold. And the school person says, to who am I speaking to? And Michael said, this is my father. So I guess it didn't work either. So anyway, in honor of Father's Day, here's a little piece of trivia about Dad's wisdom. Why, in a country of free speech, are there telephone bills? So that's just a little piece of wisdom that you can think about, right? All right. We'll get started here as we always do. Oops. I don't want to go back here again. And get started here. So anyway, Zoom Rock Room. Again, always sponsored by Lair Architect. As I encourage you all to occasionally do, drop them a little line and say hello in their new office in Lake Havasu City, where they've been in sweltering heat for the last week or so. But just say hi to Paul and Marcella Lair and let them know that you're doing well and you're enjoying the Zoom Rock Room as they are on board for another year and through April of 22 as a main sponsor. The Institute in Waynesboro coming up with a number of programs now. You can check out their website, natureandcultureinstitute.org. And the flyer here, of course, is about the Summer Stories series that's coming up, starting pretty soon. But they have a bunch of stuff starting to develop, mostly at Red Run Park outside of Waynesboro. In Rouserville, we have a person in the room tonight from Rouserville. So great little town. Redline Telescopes, Wade Kraut. Again, if you're interested in purchasing a telescope, it's going to be a pretty good skies for a couple months coming up, starting in July and August with Jupiter, Saturn, Venus is going to be visible. So there'll be some key planets to be observing if you need a telescope. Keep Redline Telescopes in mind. RedlineTelescopes.com. Extreme Cody with our buddy Andrew Epic and Cody, and check out Mining with Cody Geology series if you have not already done that. Some real cool videos that they have put together, and a couple of those include places that some of you have been with us. Tom Smith with his minerals, fossils, and rocks. I believe he's actually on board tonight in the room, but Tom will be happy to talk to you anytime that you would want to make an appointment with him by calling him and going up to Shippensburg and pay Tom a visit. He has a great assortment of minerals and fossils and lapidary stuff, rocks also, looking for new homes. So we appreciate Tom's input and his support of the Zoom Rock Room and Jones Geological Services programs that we've been doing with some of his stuff. And I do want to put this ad in since we kind of have a shortened intro tonight, not a lot to talk about. Pennsylvania Geology Magazine. This is a state publication put out by the, I still call it the Pennsylvania Geologic Survey. It's actually the Bureau of Geologic Survey, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. But it's a free quarterly magazine online, but it's again free. You may contact them by the email address there, or you can do a search on the internet for Pennsylvania Geology Magazine, and it usually brings you to the page of the index of all the volumes that have been published. You see now, I know we're up in the year 41 now or something like that. Last year they only had one issue because of the COVID. They've had one issue so far this year. And I know there's probably another one coming up pretty soon. And matter of fact, our Zoom Rock Room member, Paul Fagley, is going to have an article in Pennsylvania Geology coming up real soon. So another reason for you to subscribe, or at least do a search and read the current issue as they appear. Rock and mineral dates, again, just you can read them as well as I can read it, as I can tell you. But late July is Erie, Pennsylvania. August the 20th to 22nd, the Lebanon Valley Expo Center. The big one, September 25 and 26, Central Pennsylvania Rock and Mineral Club's show. You'll be hearing more about that. Our co-host, Brittany, is was one of the main people involved there. And October 30th, the Mineral and Fossil Swap and Sale at South Mountain Fairgrounds. The fall edition will be coming up with that. Admission is $1. And a couple of additions since we talked to you last week. Next week, we're going to do the geology of selected national parks. If you do have a favorite national park that you want to hear about the geology, let me know, and we will include that into the program. July 6th, Miocene fossils from Calvert Cliffs, Maryland. If you're looking for a cool daytime day trip down to Calvert Cliffs, very doable from southeast Pennsylvania and central Pennsylvania. So that'll be with Dr. Stephen Godfrey of the Calvert Marine Museum, a paleontologist working with the museum. He certainly knows what's going on. July 13th is a vacation day. And to give everybody, again, another break, July 20th, this is one of the new ones, Rosanna Bear of the Pennsylvania Geologic and Topographical Survey will be back with us to talk about sinkholes. You might remember she was with us last year to do caves of the Allentown area. And so she's now into sinkholes with her role with the Pennsylvania Geologic Survey. And thanks to Diana and Roger Geist of our Zoom room, they made contact with Dr. Daniel Davis with their stargazing at Cherry Springs Park the other week, and referred him to me, and we got together, and Dr. Davis is going to talk about plate tectonics in our solar system compared to Earth, what we're seeing on Earth. So Dr. Davis is from Stony Brook University up in New York State, so he was very, very willing to jump in there on a date. And we have a couple other weeks to fill in. So just like Diana did, if you have anybody in mind that would be a good speaker for the Zoom Rock Room, don't be bashful. Let us know, and we'll make the contacts and all that other stuff there. So as I said, it's a kind of a short intro tonight. There's no big news going on as far as astronomy or anything else that's worthwhile bringing up. I do have an announcement to make. Yes, I almost forgot this. Because of space on the website, and because people apparently are not really taking advantage of the videos being there, we're only going to have the last 2 or 3 weeks of programs on our website at jonesgo.com. We're going to pull the other ones down, and just like I said, keep the last 2 to 3 weeks on board, and then we'll switch them around as weeks go past. So we're looking at the numbers of people, a number of people who have viewed them, and it's less than a handful. So it's not really worth for the space on the website. So anyway, you'll have a week or two to view the previous week's program if you missed one before it goes down. So just want to let you know about that. Brittany, you have anything off the top of your head? You have anything about Mars or anything?
I had a feeling you were going to ask me, but I did not look. I know that the helicopter has made some more successful flights and that they've taken some pretty nice pictures, but I will look into that and have a better update next week.
Yeah, you can. I'm sorry putting you on the spot there.
I had a feeling you were going to, so I should have looked.
You just had that expression on your face that you really wanted to say something. So I had to get you in there. All right. Well, tonight we're happy to have back with us, although he's been here almost every week anyway as a participant in the Rock Room, Stephen Lindberg. And Stephen is having a great summer, I believe. He's getting ready for a busy fall with the field conference for Pennsylvania geologists. I know in the fall, the field trip out in his part of Pennsylvania. And some time ago, he volunteered the program he's going to do tonight. Stephen is on the faculty at the University of Pitt at Johnstown. Again, you regulars that have been with us know that he puts he gives us information, input about things that we might find mysterious. Stephen always seems to come up with the answers. So tonight, he's going to be doing the bone wars between paleontologists Edward Cope and Orthnil Marsh. So Stephen, take it away.
Thank you, Jerry. And I just want to say I very much appreciate both Jerry and Brittany. I very much appreciate the invite to come back and speak on Rock Room. I know it seems like about 2 months ago that I said I would present tonight. And then when I started preparing this topic, I didn't realize how enormously complex it was and how many little intricate details. I mentioned this topic a lot in my prehistoric life class. up at Pitt. But when you really get into some of the specifics that happened between Cope and Marsh, it's quite involved. So before I open up the PowerPoint, I just want to show you something that's very much the focus point of their bone wars. Am I appearing on the big screen right now in front of everyone when I speak, or?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. So here, I want to show you, this is a reconstruction of a Cretaceous marine reptile skull, not a dinosaur, but a marine reptile from the late Cretaceous period that flourished in the oceans. That was very much the focus and one of the high points of contention between Cope and Marsh. Much to the dismay of Cope and much to the delight of Marsh. This is Elasmosaurus, a marine reptile similar to a plesiosaur, but a slightly different animal. This skull is actually a copy of the skull that was sent to Cope in the late 1860s to reconstruct the skeleton. So with that being said, let me see, I should be able to share my screen and just give me a confirmation. That's this is visible to everyone, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so for tonight, we'll talk a little bit about what was known during and immediately after this great controversy between two very, very famous paleontologists, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, or Cope and Marsh. This was known as the Great Bone Wars, or also known as the Great Dinosaur Rush. And to kind of set the stage here, this took place during the later part of the 1800s, also during the American Civil War. So we kind of have to put things into perspective here. The country was involved in a major conflict in the from the first half of the 1860s. The Civil War raged across the United States. This was also the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Was also pretty much the golden age of dinosaur paleontology, where these enormous new discoveries were being made in bone beds on the East Coast in some locations, but very much in the western states of Wyoming and the Dakotas and Colorado and Utah. So Cope and Marsh, two very, very famous paleontologists with different backgrounds that started off as being friends, but eventually became bitter rivalries. So if we look back at examples of science and history, rivalries between great scientific minds, or not necessarily science, it can be literature, history, we can find a lot of great rivalries between competitive minds. If we go back to the early 1700s, there was the great calculus controversy between Isaac Newton and Leibniz over who discovered calculus. And that debate still continues today. Of course, Leibniz claims that he was the discoverer of calculus. Newton claims he discovered calculus. It was the only math that you needed to invent calculus in order to figure out planetary orbits and volumes of irregular shaped objects. So we had this enormous controversy between Newton and Leibniz. And then of course there was the great controversy between Charles Darwin and Richard Owen, which pretty much continued at the same time as the Great Bone Wars. As a matter of fact, both Marsh and I believe Marsh and Cope were contemporaries of Charles Darwin. But the theory of evolution, Richard Owen claims that he formulated the theory years before Charles Darwin actually made his publication after the voyage on the Beagle. And then a little closer in the late 1800s, also going on at the same time, was the what was known as the current wars. between Tesla, Nikola Tesla, George Westinghouse, and Thomas Edison. Tesla was the alternating current proponent and believed that the electrical grid that powered the United States should be alternating current. And so was George Westinghouse. Thomas Edison, on the other hand, was the big proponent of direct current or DC current. And of course, we know how that ended up. We still power some things today with DC power, but our electrical power grid is basically AC, alternating current. So we jump ahead to geology and paleontology, and we're not without great rivalries and mistakes and blunders and ruined careers. So known as the Great Bone Wars between paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh. Their enormously contemptuous, tumultuous feud over dinosaur bones pretty much rocked the geological sciences in the late 1800s. Marsh was born in 1831 in Lockport, New York. He was born to a relatively poor family. It was only through his association with his wealthy uncle by the name of George Peabody. Most people have heard of the multimillionaire George Peabody, the great philanthropist. Marsh was a nephew of George Peabody, and George Peabody saw great potential in Marsh as a young person. His family did not really have enough money to send him to school. So his schooling, he first attended the Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, and graduated in 1856. George Peabody funded that for him. He then attended Yale College in New Haven, Connecticut, and graduated with a bachelor's degree, a BA degree in 1860, which was paid for by George Peabody. He then went on to attend Yale College Sheffield School from 1860 to 1862, at the beginning of the Civil War. He studied geology, mineralogy, chemistry, and he earned his master's degree. Following his completion of his master's degree and with additional funding from George Peabody, Marsh traveled overseas and went to Germany, where he mainly studied at the University of Berlin. So at the University of Berlin, he studied paleontology and anatomy from 1862 to 1865. Once again, his family was relatively poor. He was not a privileged child, and he didn't come from a privileged background. It was only through his wealthy uncle that he was able to accomplish all of this. And his uncle believed that he was destined for great things. Following his studies, the completion of his studies in Berlin, Germany, he returned to the United States in 1866. And through political connections of George Peabody and other associates, he was appointed head and professor of vertebrate paleontology at Yale University. And the important thing about this was paleontology was just becoming a relatively new science. And Marsh was actually the first official vertebrate or the first official paleontologist to hold a position in the United States. Once again, in 1866, through a wealthy grant from Peabody, George Peabody gave Yale a donation of $150,000 in his name and Marsh's name, and they established the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale. After George Peabody's death in 1869, Marsh received a $100,000 inheritance, and that helped finance his expeditions out west. So now the whole time while this was going on, when he was appointed head of vertebrate paleontology at Yale, he was also involved in new dinosaur discoveries, started taking trips out west to Colorado, Utah, and the famous Como Bluffs in Wyoming. So his discovery and description of dinosaurs began in the 1860s. Some of the things he's credited with doing, and of course, Marsh was a famous dinosaur and vertebrate paleontologist. In 1871, Marsh is credited with discovering the first pterosaur, pterodactyl, in the Cretaceous chalk, the Niobrara chalk of Kansas. Marsh is credited with discovering, in the 1870s, Marsh is credited with discovering Stegosaurus, Triceratops, Brontosaurus, Allosaurus, the earlier, I don't want to say the earlier version of T-Rex, but the Jurassic, the large Jurassic theropod that preceded T-Rex. So Stegosaurus, Triceratops, Brontosaurus, Allosaurus, and Apatosaurus. Marsh is also credited with discovering thousands of dinosaur bones within the Morrison Formation, Jurassic Age. Morrison Formation at what is today known as Dinosaur Ridge in Colorado, and Como Bluffs in Wyoming, which is an incredibly rich, Como Bluffs is shown here on the right-hand side. This is an incredibly rich dinosaur, fossiliferous dinosaur layer. Here's a modern-day photograph of Dinosaur Ridge in Colorado. In the Morrison Formation, where dinosaur footprints are exposed, and within the other layers, paleontologists have recovered hundreds, if not thousands, of dinosaur bones. Here's a 1870 photograph of Marsh and an expedition out in Wyoming on a dinosaur hunting expedition. Along with the discovery of dinosaurs in 1878, Marsh's workers at Como Bluffs, Wyoming, discovered a mammal fossil. And this was an important discovery because it proved the existence of mammals as early as the Jurassic period during the Mesozoic era. So we now had a more direct link of the evolution of mammals at the same time as dinosaurs. During this time, Marsh was eventually appointed chief vertebrate paleontologist for the newly formed United States Geological Survey. He served as that vertebrate paleontologist from 1882 to 1892. From 1883 to 1895, he was president of the National Academy of Sciences. In 1896, he published a very, very well-known manuscript that's still available today in reprint, The Dinosaurs of North America. And in my haste to get ready for this evening's class, I have an original copy of this downstairs in my files, not signed by Marsh, but it's an original copy from 1886. It's one of my prized possessions. If we take a quick break at the end of class, maybe while people are discussing things, I'll run downstairs and get it and I'll show it to you. But this is the cover of one. This was an outstanding publication that listed pretty much all of the known dinosaurs in 1896 that Marsh had discovered. Marsh was a very careful, methodical researcher. He had a much more complete education than Cope. Not as privileged as Cope, and once again, his education was due to the funding by George Peabody. But Marsh was very careful in his publications, and he rarely made errors. Eventually, Marsh would go on to discover 80 new species of dinosaurs. Eventually, on March 18th, kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but on March 18th, 1889, he passed away. We'll talk a little bit about that later. He died almost penniless, losing an enormous amount of prestige, and his appointments at the U.S. Geological Survey and the Smithsonian Institution, accused of bribery and scandalous affairs and misappropriation of government funds. He's buried in New Haven, Connecticut. Here's his headstone in New Haven, Connecticut. You can see Marsh on it. And here's another photograph. This was taken in 1872, getting ready for another dinosaur expedition out west. The thing I like best about this photograph is you can see that the workers present in his dinosaur excavation camps were well armed. That's either a Winchester or a Henry repeating rifle, and we can see a Sharp's carbine there. They look ready to deal with any interruptions to their dinosaur digs. So that kind of paints the picture of the type of person that Marsh was. So now we have Edward Cope, Edward Drinker Cope. Cope, on the other hand, Cope was born in 1840 near just outside, I believe, a little bit north of Philadelphia, PA. Kind of the opposite of Marsh. Cope was born to a very, very wealthy Quaker family. At a young age, Cope's father operated a large family farm and very much desired Cope to continue the tradition of family farming. But even at an early age, at a young school age, Cope showed ambitions towards science and a natural interest in understanding scientific subjects. At age 12, Cope attended the Friends boarding school, which was a Quaker boarding school located in Westtown. That's near current Westchester, PA. This was quite expensive. It had an annual tuition of $500, but coming from a wealthier family, they were able to pay this. While in school, Cope studied astronomy, Latin, chemistry, algebra, philosophy, and scripture. But interestingly enough, he was not a very strong student. Not a very strong student at all. And his teachers described him as being less than perfect and not quite satisfactory. So he tended to have poor grades, but he continued in school, never attended college, had no formal training, I believe, beyond the boarding school. So no advanced degree, no formal training, but always had a great deal of interest in fossils and paleontology. When he finished school, Cope's father continued to kind of try to turn him towards family farming, and Cope is quoted as saying, "That would be dreadfully boring to spend my life as a farmer." As he engaged in studying fossils and went on little digs of his own, he became acquainted with other contacts at the National Academy of Sciences. He would go there, that's in Philadelphia. He would go there and bring in his fossil specimens that he found. He became acquainted with the other paleontologists that worked there and the scientists and geologists. And he eventually started working part-time in 1858 at the National Academy of Sciences. It was then that he was able to attend the University of Pennsylvania from 1861 to 1862, just about a little over a year. He studied anatomy under what was then a very, very famous contemporary paleontologist, Joseph Leidy. He was a very, very proficient publisher of papers. He wrote excessively on reptiles, amphibians, fossils, dinosaurs, hundreds, well over 1,000 published papers. So continuing with Cope, we don't have a lot of photographs of him involved in field work out west. Here's a picture in the lower right-hand corner, one of the few I could find. This is Cope in Philadelphia. This is, I believe, in his office at the National Academy of Sciences. The interesting thing is fate brought these two paleontologists together. From 1863 to 1864, Cope left the United States and traveled through Europe. And there's kind of always been a little undercurrent of rumor here that Cope's father did not want him involved in the Civil War, did not want him drafted into the Union Army. So his father convinced him to travel to Europe to avoid the Civil War, and he did. He spent 1863 to 1864 in Europe. And the interesting thing is while Marsh was studying at the University of Berlin, that is when Cope and Marsh met. So in the winter of 1863, Cope met Marsh in Berlin. Marsh was attending the University of Berlin. They became friends. They became friends in Europe. The story is that Marsh immediately took a liking to him. He showed him all around Berlin. They would have dinner together. They compared notes. They compared fossils. They toured museums together. Eventually, Marsh returned to the United States. By 1863, Marsh had published 37 scientific papers. Cope had published 37 scientific papers compared to Marsh's 2. But Marsh's 2 were much more detailed and included the dinosaurs of North America. Marsh was such a prolific publisher that a lot of his papers contained errors or misidentification of fossil species, that he misidentified species that had been previously identified by other researchers in previous years. They continued to be friends. Their friendship flourished to the point where in the late 1860s, Cope named a large Carboniferous tetrapod, a four-legged amphibian, I believe, Colosteus marshi, after Marsh in 1867. So a large Carboniferous tetrapod that was discovered and described by Cope, he named after his friend. And his friend felt quite honored. And in 1869, Marsh returned the favor and named a mosasaur, a large Cretaceous marine reptile, not a dinosaur. A mosasaur is a marine reptile. Marsh named a Cretaceous mosasaur, Mosasaurus copianus, for Cope. So the two of them were such good friends, they were even naming dinosaurs and other Mesozoic reptiles after each other. The interesting thing, a little side story to this, is Marsh acquired this mosasaur from one of the quarries in New Jersey that Cope had been collecting fossils at. So Marsh had bribed the workers in one of Cope's quarries of research that if they found any new fossils, they should send them to Marsh and not Cope. So the interesting little caveat here is that he basically stole the mosasaur from Cope's quarry and then in turn named it after him. And Cope was still quite thrilled with that honor. Cope returned to the United States in 1864. He spent several years at Haverford College in Pennsylvania, but they awarded him an honorary master's degree, but he never really completed any master's degree courses. And he became a professor of zoology and botany. In the 1870s, both Marsh and Cope focused their expeditions and their dinosaur hunting on the western states. They uncovered hundreds of new species. I'm going to say tens of thousands of dinosaur bones, and very, very prolific publishers of scientific papers. The 1870s were a high point for Cope's career. Cope published in just 1 year, in 1870, Cope published 76 papers, professional papers, on new fossil finds that included Lystrosaurus, which is a small little reptile that's been used to link the continents together for Pangea, Camposaurus, Amphiochelus, which was a large sauropod, a large four-legged dinosaur discovered in Colorado. During his career, Cope published over 1,400 papers, described and discovered over 1,000 new fossil species, including many dinosaurs. Eventually, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, Cope died in 1897 at the age of 56, pretty much penniless, separated from his wife and children. He pretty much, at the end of his life, needed to sell off his entire fossil collection to pay for his medical expenses and the expenses that he incurred trying to fight against Marsh's attacks on him. And likewise with Marsh. Marsh died almost penniless also. But Cope developed a serious, what we believe is a gastrointestinal illness, and he passed away on April 12th, 1897. He is not buried. There's no headstone. There's no cemetery. Shortly before his death, he challenged Marsh to donate his body to science because Cope had decided that he was going to donate his body to science. At the time, in the late 1800s, it was believed that the larger your cranial cavity, and the larger your brain, the more intelligent you were. We kind of know that's not true. Cope believed that his intelligence was due to a large cranial cavity and a large brain. So before his death, he made arrangements to have his body donated to science. After his death, his body ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, where they dissected him and they removed his head, analyzed his brain. I think they found that his brain was no larger than an average human brain. His bones, I believe, were cleaned and are still preserved in a sterile locker at the University of Pennsylvania, and they have his skull. So he's still preserved at the University of Pennsylvania. Marsh had a totally different fate. So that kind of sets the background for these two individuals. And here's just another summary of Cope. During his lifetime, a prolific publisher of scientific papers, but he made a lot of errors. They weren't perfect. Cope, he was a good paleontologist, but he wasn't the best, and he made some dramatic errors. And Elasmosaurus was the height of error and embarrassment, and much to the delight of Marsh, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So some of Cope's diagrams. This is from, he was a very good illustrator. This is from a paper that he wrote, the vertebrata of the tertiary formations of the Far West. Here is his study at the time of his death in his home, still cluttered with papers and fossil bones, and still in the midst of study. This is a fairly famous illustration from one of his papers showing the infamous Elasmosaurus, or at least his reconstruction of it. The only problem is you can see this is Elasmosaurus, this marine reptile. In Cope's reconstruction, here's the head, but unfortunately, this is not the neck, this is the tail, and this is the neck over here. So here is his, this is Cope's original reconstruction of Elasmosaurus, and this is what it should really look like. And he kind of made the ultimate mistake that any paleontologist could make. So that kind of leads us to the bone wars. So I've kind of described their two careers, but beginning in the late 1860s, that's when the relationship really started to go downhill. The whole time their expeditions out west were going on, there developed an increasing sense of professional jealousy. Who could find the most dinosaurs, and who could find the newest species of dinosaur? Their methods of dinosaur bone recovery out west were somewhat questionable. This was a rush to find dinosaur bones, and the methods they used would often destroy thousands of specimens. It was not uncommon for them to dig into the cliffs that contain thousands of dinosaur bones and load the holes with hundreds of pounds of dynamite and dynamite away entire layers of rock to try to get down to fresh layers, and in the process destroying very, very valuable specimens. We discover a dinosaur today and we don't use dynamite to uncover the bones. It's a very long, steady process, but the rush was on to try to find as many new species as possible. It involved bribery, stealing, spying on both sides, misappropriation of government funds. Both Marsh and Cope were funded through government grants from the National Academy of Science and the Smithsonian. And this formed the famous Bone Wars. And here's a little cartoon I found. It was actually a comic book published about this. And we'll talk about this in the next slide or two. Cope received the skeleton of this large marine reptile. It's kind of misrepresented a little bit here in the cartoon, but the reptile was discovered in the Cretaceous beds of Kansas. The bones were shipped to Cope. Cope assembled the skeleton, but he put the head on the wrong end, and he ignored some very basic anatomy. And he published papers showing the incorrect assemblage of the fossil. People came in and they viewed the skeleton, and it was on display at the National Academy of Science in Philadelphia until Leidy and Marsh came to view it. And as soon as they stepped into the room, well, we'll get to that in a second. A very embarrassing moment for Cope. So the first shots fired in the Bone War, there was growing contention between both of these men. And the main Bone War battle began in 1868. Cope, being headquartered in Philadelphia, was very close to New Jersey. And in the early part of the 1800s, a discovery was made in Haddonfield, New Jersey. This is a modern day view of the Haddonfield Quarry. But in 1838, they discovered some very large bones in a marl pit, variety of limestone. So in 1838, some very large bones were discovered in the marl pit in Haddonfield, New Jersey. These bones were excavated, but it wasn't until 1858 that the large bones were finally identified as being a dinosaur, and it was a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur. It was actually one of the first dinosaurs ever discovered in North America, and the first duck-billed dinosaur. Being very close to this location, Cope was involved in the excavation of a lot of the Haddonfield quarries. So in 1868, their friendship was still on pretty good terms. Cope invited Marsh to come to Haddonfield and view the excavations of these bones being found in Haddonfield. Either during this visit or shortly after, Marsh contacted the workers in the quarry and bribed them. And he offered to pay them more money if they would send him the dinosaur bones instead of sending them to Cope. So going behind Cope's back, Marsh was able to bribe the workers to send him the bones from Haddonfield. And this really began the feud. So when Cope found out about this, they exchanged nasty letters and public statements, and the Bone Wars had begun. The same year, in 1868, a large fossil reptile, which is shown here, now known as Elasmosaurus, a large fossil reptile was discovered near Fort Wallace, Kansas, in the Cretaceous Pier Shale, which is a fairly well-known reptile and dinosaur-bearing layer. As soon as the discovery was made, several vertebrae were sent to Cope. And as soon as Cope received the vertebrae, he recognized that it was a marine reptile. And he recognized it as being a marine reptile similar to a plesiosaur. He requested that as soon as possible, the rest of the bones would be sent to him at the Academy in Philadelphia. And they did. I believe in December of 1868, 800 pounds of bones were sent to Cope, and they arrived at the National Academy of Science in Philadelphia. So they were sent to him in December. I believe he received them in March. He rushed to prep the bones and assemble the skeleton of this newly discovered marine reptile. In his haste, he made detailed sketches, and he published a paper of his reconstructed Elasmosaurus. And the paper was distributed to scientific journals and societies in the United States and all across the world. hundreds of copies were distributed. And here is this middle diagram. Here is his original sketch of the reconstructed Elasmosaurus. You can see the head, the vertebrae and the ribs and the spinal processes. It was not complete. It was missing the back flippers. This was actually a 4-flippered animal. Cope assumed that it only had 2 front flippers. So he called the new species, this new species of long-necked reptile Elasmosaurus platyurus. And this translates to thin plate reptile in reference to the structure of the vertebrae. He published his paper in 1869, but totally unaware, this is not the neck. This is the tail, and this is the neck. And he ignored some critically obvious vertebrate paleontology that has always been a mystery. No one has ever been able to figure this out. A lot of paleontologists believe that he was in such a rush to publish his paper and get his name out there as describing a new species of marine reptile that he thought he was looking at something similar to a plesiosaur. A plesiosaur has a short neck and a long tail. So Cope assumed that the longer segments of the vertebrae were the tail, and he placed the head at the short end. So this is completely wrong. This fossil was on display in the National Academy of Science. Cope published his paper, and here is a page from the original paper. So his original paper with his very, very nicely detailed sketches of the vertebrae, and this went on for pages and pages, but here's the same pictures in the previous slide. There's the head, here's the neck and the tail, the long tail. He definitely knew that he had an aquatic reptile. When it was discovered this was an error, he rushed to try to recall all of the published papers, but the damage was already done. In 1870, he republished a paper, and you can see these sketches. Look at the vertebrae. Everything else is pretty much the same here with the addition of a few new vertebrae, but look at his corrected version of Elasmosaurus. He added another flipper to the back, and now he's got the head on the correct end. Elasmosaurus had a very, very long neck and a short tail. It's always been a mystery as to how he could have done this. Here's a close-up. I am not an expert in vertebrate paleontology, and I'm not an expert in dinosaur vertebrate paleontology, but when you look at the skeleton of a Mesozoic-aged reptile or a dinosaur, there are certain features of the vertebrae that tell you which end is anterior and which end is posterior. And Cope either totally disregarded these or just ignored them. This is the tail. These are caudal tail vertebrae. And these little bones sticking out on the underside of the vertebrae are called chevrons. Many dinosaurs and reptiles have chevrons. They're little V-shaped, they're 2 V-shaped bones that stick out on the caudal vertebrae, the tail of a dinosaur. This is the most obvious indication. This is the tail, and these are tail chevrons. The head does not belong here. The head belongs on the other end. He actually had some of the vertebrae reversed too. The story goes that in 1870, in early 1870, Marsh and the famous paleontologist Joseph Leidy visited the National Academy of Science. They wanted to see the reconstruction of Cope's Elasmosaurus. And they walked into the room, and the story is that Marsh and Leidy visited Cope at the National Academy of Science to view the assembled skeleton. They stood there in front of the skeleton, and Leidy immediately walked over to the skeleton and he put his hands on the head and pulled the head off the assembled skeleton, walked around to the other end, and stuck it on the end of the tail. And he said, "Now you have it correct, Professor Cope." The story goes that Marsh bursted out in laughter, and this was the high point of the dinosaur wars. Marsh took every opportunity he could over the next 10 years to ridicule Cope about this massive error in paleontology. I just want to go back here one slide. It's not in here. Let me see. You really can't see it. It doesn't show in this view, but Cope also ignored the fact that the first two vertebrae, and if I have this correct, the first two vertebrae in the spinal column are the axis and atlas vertebrae. They're very, very large, thick vertebrae that support the skull. The atlas and axis vertebrae were still in place on the end of what he thought was the tail. The two vertebrae were here, and he totally ignored them. Had he taken the time to stick the head on the other end, it fit perfectly against the atlas and axis vertebrae, and that's what Lady noticed right away. This was an incredible error. It was much to the delight of Marsh, and he took every opportunity to ridicule Cope about this major blunder. Cope tried to recall all of the published papers. In his republished paper in the spring of 1870, he tried to correct that, but the damage was already done. Cope was ridiculed about this for many years. It was the height of the dinosaur wars. After this, both paleontologists continued to excavate dinosaurs out west and in New Jersey, but their feud continued. And it only added to the discredit of both of them. In the late 1870s and early 1890s, Cope and Marsh, they both intensified their search for dinosaur fossils in the Western state, but the hostilities increased. Marsh was accused, and we know he did this, Marsh was accused of hiring spies to work in Cope's dinosaur excavations and report back to him the findings that Cope was making. To counter this, Cope countered by rushing to publish papers on new finds, publishing those 76 papers in 1 year. To kind of add insult to injury, in 1882, Marsh was appointed the chief paleontologist of the United States Geological Survey, which gave him enormous power and control over federal funds and research and recognition of other scientists and paleontologists. And he used that to his advantage. Once Marsh became chief paleontologist of the U.S. Geological Survey, he cut off funding to Cope because Cope was being funded by the U.S. government for part of his excavations of dinosaurs. He cut off funding. He used his position to continue to ridicule Cope and belittle him. Cope retaliated and accused Marsh of government corruption and misuse of government funds. Cope accused Marsh of taking a lot of the dinosaurs and the dinosaur bones that he had discovered on western digs, especially at Como Bluffs, Wyoming, and using the dinosaur bones for his own personal collection and profit, selling the dinosaur bones to private collectors instead of placing them in the National Museum and the Smithsonian. Eventually, Cope turned over hundreds of pages of written documents to a reporter at the New York Herald newspaper. And the newspaper published an article titled "Scientists Wage Bitter Warfare." This created several weeks of intense rivalry between the two paleontologists, kind of now near the end of their careers. As a result of this article and the accusations made by Cope, Congress intervened and investigated Marsh. they eliminated the Department of Paleontology from the U.S. Geological Survey. They removed Marsh from his appointment and cut off funding. As a result, Marsh was in such dire financial state that he sold off a lot of his personal collection just to manage to live. And not only that, but Congress required him, he was required to turn over the rest of his collection to the federal government. Marsh eventually became ill and died in 1899 with just $186 in his bank account. And of course, Cope died 2 years earlier from that intestinal illness in 1897. The same thing, Cope had lost his wife, his family to separation. He pretty much ended his career ridiculed as a paleontologist. He, in turn, sold off most of his collection for about, I believe, about $25,000 to fund the living in the last days of his life. So a truly bitter rivalry, but through all of this, it has a bright side. Their competition to outdo each other, although their methods were highly questionable, and especially a lot of Cope's descriptions of dinosaurs and new discoveries were in error. They uncovered more new dinosaur species and fossil species in the late 1800s than any other paleontologist at the time. They discovered new dinosaur-bearing rock layers. So their discoveries added to the amount of dinosaur and Mesozoic era knowledge that we had 100-fold before these two were involved. And had it not been for their great conflict, and had it not been for their enormous competition between each other, a lot of these discoveries may not have been made. So kind of in the end, who won the bone wars? Well, at the end of his career, Cope is credited with discovering 56 new dinosaur species, and Marsh discovered 80 new dinosaur species. Together, they're credited with discovering Triceratops, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, Stegosaurus, Camarasaurus, Coelophysis. At the time Coelophysis was discovered, that was actually the type specimen that defined a dinosaur. There's a lot of other things that could have gone into detail on both of the scientists, other discoveries that they made with plants and animals and evolution. Marsh, the little diagram I have here, Marsh is credited as being one of the first scientists to suggest that birds are descended from dinosaurs. The bone wars led to an enormous popularity of dinosaurs with the public. Museums were opening up with dinosaurs on display. The famous dinosaur paleontologist Bob Bacher, has been quoted as saying, as a result of the dinosaur wars, the dinosaurs that came from the Como Bluffs not only filled museums, but filled magazine articles, textbooks, and filled people's minds. So a lot of the layers, the fossiliferous layers from the Mesozoic era that were discovered by Marsh and Cope, are still being explored today, including Dinosaur Ridge in Colorado. So an interesting story of both gentlemen. So with that, I tried to cover a lot, but I also left out a lot because I realized I'd be limited to just 45 minutes. So with that, I can, I'll stop the share and come back to the screen. And questions, comments, or?
Yeah, I was just curious, what museum was it that Marsh took the head and?
Oh, that was in the National Academy of Science in Philadelphia. So the National Academy of Science in Philadelphia had a vertebrate paleontology museum, and there's a little bit of debate about whether Marsh was actually present there. and of course, you go from source to source. There's been a lot written about this. You go from source to source, and of course, the stories vary a little bit. But it was definitely the famous paleontologist Joseph Leidy that walked over and actually physically grabbed the skull and removed it and said, "Professor Marsh, you have the skull on the wrong end." And of course, there were lots of other people present in the room at that time. And you can imagine the embarrassment.
Yeah, but wasn't it Marsh who removed it?
It was Leidy. Marsh was there and witnessed it and supposedly burst out laughing. But Leidy actually walked over and removed the skull from Elasmosaurus and put it on the other end. And he also pointed out to Cope. He said, "Dear Professor Cope, the axis and atlas vertebrae are still in place on your assembled skeleton, yet you put the head on the end of the tail, totally ignoring the vertebrate anatomy that was right in front of you. Caudal, tail chevrons and all." So
you said that Marsh rarely made any mistakes.
They both made mistakes, but Marsh made fewer. And that may be a result of publishing fewer papers. Cope was a much more prolific publisher. As soon as he found something, he published it. Marsh was much more careful in publishing papers. And I'll have to remember next week during the introduction to Zoom, I'll make sure I have a copy of his original Dinosaurs of North America. That was one of his first publications. And at that time, it had pretty much all of the known dinosaurs that had been discovered by Marsh. So.
See, we have a question from Debbie Saylor, wants to know what fossils show feather development.
Oh, okay. That could be, wow, that could be another entire rock Zoom room in itself. Do you know what? I actually happen to have it right here with me, just by coincidence. I don't have the real one. I've got, I don't know, is this coming up on the big screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the first what's the word I'm looking for? The first direct evidence that the first direct fossil evidence of a feathered bird was discovered in the late 1930s in Germany in the Solnhofen limestone. The Solnhofen limestone is a prolific fossil layer, and workers splitting apart the limestone in the quarry discovered a fossil of a bird that clearly had the preserved image of feathers. Now, that's Archaeopteryx, the Berlin sample. I have a copy of that, but I don't have it up here in the den with me right now. I just happen to have this one sitting on the floor here. This is Archaeopteryx eichstätt. So this is one of the better preserved Archaeopteryx feathered birds of the Jurassic period here. You can see compared to the size of my hand. This is a reproduction. It's a cast made from resin. Archaeopteryx eichstätt, this was discovered in 1951, and it was scientifically described in 1974. The actual fossil is housed at the Jura Museum in Eichstätt. I don't have that all memorized. I have it written on the back here, so I'm cheating. So I have labels on the back. What makes this one so spectacular? There's very few complete Archaeopteryx feathered bird fossils that were discovered. This one has the most complete head. So out of all the Archaeopteryx, this one has the most complete detailed head. And on close examination, you can see that the head is it's a reptilian skull, and there's little conical pointed teeth, and birds do not have pointed teeth. This one does not have clear impressions of the feathers, but the fossil did have, the limestone was stained. You can see the stain around it. And the original Archaeopteryx and other ones do have very, very clear impressions of the feathers. When first discovered, everybody thought it was a fake, that someone had carved or etched the feathers into the rock. But we now know that a lot of others have been discovered, separate feathers, tail feathers. So the link between birds and dinosaurs goes back to the Jurassic and the Solnhofen limestone. And some earlier ones have been discovered. There's been a couple of discoveries in China. So.
And we have a lot of people requesting an encore presentation in the future. So,
well.
Dennis Lowe says, interesting story. They would probably be working in China today.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So, and of course, you know, if you follow dinosaur paleontology, there's new discoveries being made all the time. I mean, it's within the last year, there have been some remarkable discoveries made. And in the last 10 or 15 years, we now have nano Tyrannosaurus. There's the huge sauropods that are being discovered down in Patagonia in Argentina. My department chair, Chris Kokenauer, my department chair here at Pitt Johnstown, was involved in that discovery. So part of his PhD work was with Mike Baer is here. Mike, what's the name of the vertebrate paleontologist at Carnegie that we know? I can't remember.
That's Matt Lamana.
That's right, Matt Lamana. Matt Lamana is the vertebrate paleontologist at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and my department chair, Chris Kokenauer, worked with Matt Lamana doing his PhD fieldwork in Patagonia. And I'll have to see if I can find them, but we have some pictures of Chris sitting next to these enormous femurs and leg bones of the giant sauropods that were discovered in Patagonia, among the largest animals to ever walk on the earth. So.
anybody have?
Hey, Steve. So,
Okay.
all right, Amy and I went to the Carnegie Museum today, and I just ended up getting a couple pictures. So I don't know if you can see. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, there it
Actually,
is.
the
Yep.
Archaeopteryx graphica. And this is also because the original is in Germany. It's it shows the prints. And then there one other one got a shot. This is, I don't know if anyone can see the or not.
That came up. I saw that.
Sinosauropteryx.
You're breaking up a lot, Mike.
And then also, this is a shows feather imprints on a dinosaur.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, that's all.
Anybody have any other questions? Just unmute yourself.
Just real quick, just because you brought it up, and just because I'm working on the series now, is it a baby or is it a different species?
I couldn't. Did anyone else hear? He was breaking up. I couldn't hear anything he was saying.
He was breaking up, but I think he was talking about whether or not the small fossil that was found that's similar to T-Rex. I think he was asking if you thought it was a baby T-Rex or a different species.
Oh boy, that's
sorry, Nanotyrannus.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, nano Tyrannosaurus. We do have several juvenile T-Rex fossils. The most famous one, I don't happen to have a picture of it here, but discovered in South Dakota. I think it was 1998. Tinker. It was named Tinker. I'll have to remember next week. I'll bring a couple of pictures in of Tinker, but if you do a Google search for Tinker, that was a juvenile T-Rex discovered in South Dakota, almost complete skeleton. Okay, the debate over Nano Tyrannosaurus is whether Nano Tyrannosaurus is a juvenile T-Rex or a totally different species. The debate is still going on, and here's the best evidence that it's a totally different species. Nano Tyrannosaurus has more openings in its jaw for teeth. So I offhand, I don't know what they're called, but the holes in the jawbone where the teeth go in. Nano Tyrannosaurus has many more teeth sockets. That's it. I can't think of that word. The sockets that the teeth go in. Nano Tyrannosaurus has numerous more teeth sockets than the holotype T-Rex. So that's leading some paleontologists to believe that it's a different species. Whether it's a immature baby T-Rex of a different species, we don't know yet. But that's probably the most compelling evidence that Nano Tyrannosaurus is a different species based on the number of sockets for the teeth in the mouth. But the skull structure is very similar. Of course, the thing we always have to keep in mind with dinosaur fossils is think about one of the big concepts and tenets in paleontology is that only a relatively very, very, very small number of vertebrate animals become fossilized. So we have a very, very tiny picture of what life was like during the Mesozoic era. When you look at the total number of years that T-Rex inhabited the Earth during the late Cretaceous period over a time span of 10 million years, how many T-Rexes inhabited the Earth over 10 million years? Now the estimates are ranging that there were billions of T-Rexes inhabiting the Earth over a 10 million year period. Yet, how many complete fossils of T-Rex do we have, or almost complete fossils of T-Rex? There's probably only about 100. So one of the primary tenets of paleontology is that we have a very, very incomplete picture of, go back to any geologic period, and the odds of an animal becoming fossilized are extremely low. There are probably tens of thousands of dinosaurs, other animals that inhabited the Earth that we have no record. We'll never know they were here because they were never fossilized. Especially a large animal like a vertebrate, a large animal like a dinosaur. The conditions for an entire dinosaur to become fossilized are extremely rare. But we do find them. But our picture is very, very incomplete. So I think it's a different, well, that was the long answer. The short answer is I think Nano Tyrannosaurus, it's a different species based on the sockets, the number of sockets in the jaw. So.
I don't know if you can still hear me, but yeah, there might be one other piece of evidence coming soon. I'm not allowed to talk about it. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. And you know what? That's the way science works, right? The way science works is that, you make a discovery and you publish what you think is the correct version. And then another discovery is made and it clarifies it. And look at what's the classic example? I can't remember it exactly, but they had the wrong head on Apatosaurus, right? Or was it Diplodocus or Apatosaurus? Every museum in the world had the wrong skull. No, we're not talking about Elasmosaurus, but every museum in the world had the wrong skull on Apatosaurus. Or it might have been Diplodocus. And the reason they had the wrong skull on it was because when the first fossil was found, they found the vertebrae and there was a skull nearby. So everybody assumed that skull went with the sauropod dinosaur. And then every museum in the world had the wrong skull on it. They all went into their cabinets and they put the skull, and well, we found the correct skull. And then, well, a couple of years, well, I'm not quite exactly sure what date, but Diplodocus was found articulated with the skull still on the mounted on the neck vertebrae, and it was a totally different skull. So when that was published, every museum in the world at night, after tourists left the museum and they locked it up, they all went downstairs and they found the correct skull, and they put a ladder up and they stuck the correct skull. So the next day when everybody came into the museum, the correct skull was put in place, because they had them in storage. They just didn't know what it belonged to. So.
And
Okay.
I could be wrong about this, but isn't in the world of paleontology, 50% of a skeleton is considered a complete fossil?
Yeah, I would say pretty close to that, and it's rare to even find 50% of the skeleton. I'm trying to think the most complete T-Rex. I don't know if it was Sue, the famous Sue T-Rex that's now in the Chicago Field Museum. I don't know if it was Sue or if it was Stan, the one that the Black Hills Institute had, but yeah, if you can find 50%. Sue was pretty complete. I think Sue was only missing a couple of bones, and the reason we think Sue was only missing a couple of bones is she was walking along the high bank of a river, and the bank collapsed, and she slid down into the river and drowned, and her body was carried downstream and washed up onto a sandbar in the middle of the river, and she was, before nothing else could reach her to tear the carcass apart. So she was buried by sediment, and a couple of bones here and there are missing, but she was incredibly complete. So yeah, if you go to any museum that has dinosaurs on display and you see these beautifully preserved dinosaur skeletons, if you look very closely, you can sometimes tell at least half of the bones are resin. They've been made and painted and put up in there to replace the ones that are missing. As a matter of fact, in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, that could be another story in itself. I don't want to go on too long here, but the Tyrannosaurus Rex that's on display at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh is T-Rex #1. It is holotype T-Rex. That is the first Tyrannosaurus Rex ever discovered in North America. And it's right here in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And when you walk into the Hall of Dinosaurs, and there's two T-Rexes there. The T-Rex on the left is the real one, and the T-Rex on the right is a copy. I think it's completely 100% fabricated, because they wanted two T-Rexes facing each other. So they made molds of the real T-Rex, and they cast a second one. But that is T-Rex #1, the first T-Rex ever discovered. That's the holotype. Every other Tyrannosaurus Rex that's discovered is compared to the one in the Carnegie. That is the holotype species. So.
And who is Sue?
Sue? Sue was the large, complete Tyrannosaurus Rex discovered by Sue Hendrickson on a dinosaur expedition. She was on, I think it's part of the Black Hills Institute of Paleontology. She discovered it on the last morning of a field camp in that region of South Dakota. She looked up at the cliff and she saw part of the skull sticking out. And after years of legal battles, she was returned to the property owner, who then put her up for auction, and she was purchased by the Chicago Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum, and that's where she's on display now. So,
Yeah, and where was that camp?
Somewhere in South Dakota. I'm not exactly sure, but it was in the most famous dinosaur-bearing layer in the Dakotas is the Late Cretaceous Hell Creek Formation. The Hell Creek Formation is pretty much the one layer that you can find Tyrannosaurus Rex in. T-Rex.
What layer is that again? The what layer?
It's called the Hell Creek. The Hell Creek Formation, named after the location in South Dakota. But the Hell Creek Formation is pretty much that's T-Rex rock layer. Yeah, and I think Mike Bear said, Mike Bear put a comment in too about the dinosaur known as iguanodon was put together incorrectly too. So, but that's the way science works. You know, you make a discovery, you find out something's wrong, and then you correct it. So, yep.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stephen, for the wonderful program. Lots of good information, and like I said, we need an encore back from you sometime. So before I hand it over to Brittany, while having their evening dinner together, a little girl looked at her father and asked, "Daddy, you are the boss in this family, right?" The father was very pleased to hear it, and he confidently replied, "Yes, my little princess." The girl then continued, "That's because mommy put you in charge, right?" So anyway, Brittany,
So what's the joke?
I'll let you close it out there, Brittany.
No, what was the aim of the joke, Jerry? The girl looked at Dad, called him boss, like Boston.
That's because mommy put him in charge of the family.
So what? So boss, like Boston.
No, Dad was put in charge of. Mom told Dad to be in charge of the family.
Alrighty. Well, thanks so much, Steve. That was great. I personally love these kind of stories about feuds and with scientists. So I really enjoyed that. I think everyone else did too. So
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. So it was good to see everybody, and I hope everyone has a good week.
See you next week for National Parks.
Hey, Jerry, let's think, just real quick, let's think about an outing. If people want to get together sometime over the summer to go fossil collecting by Bedford.
We've been thinking about it.
All right.
I have to find a Saturday that's open.
Yep. No
Okay.
problem. Or we could even do it early fall. So,
Okay.
all right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
We'll
Thanks,
see you,
Steve.
everybody. Yep.
Bye, everyone.